Right, this is What the Jam. Today we're joined by Brian Rinaldi, who is the developer experience engineer at Launch Darkly. He runs a newsletter called Jamstack. He wrote the book on Jamstack called the Jamstack book, and he's running a conference early next year called the Jam. Safe to say, Brian lives and breathes all things Jamstack, so I'm very excited to have him on today. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Let's start at the beginning. What does Jamstack mean to you?
Oh God, I mean I've been doing this since I think I started messing with Jekyll in like 2013 maybe. And there was no term Jamstack at the time. I was just talking about static sites, right? And then eventually that term came around and it was some variation of static sites mixed in with like client-side JavaScript and maybe a little bit of serverless here and there, right? And then it's evolved a lot. I think today it's part of the problem has been that the term got so overloaded with stuff that was, largely like, platform has a new offering. Suddenly that's part of Jamstack. So I think if I've been an advocate of paring it back a little bit. I think if the term is going to survive, it needs to be a little less amorphous, and I am fine with it not fitting every use case. I think it's fine if it's just you know largely static, maybe with some serverless and some little dash of SSR thrown in here and there to kind of meet some use cases, but it's still largely like static based output. So
Yeah, nice. So let's drill into that a little bit. Like, what do you? Um, I always think of it as like a pyramid, where the definition of Jamstack or whatever the term is at the top, but at the
Mhm.
foundation, it's like the core values or like principles. And at least from my memory, initially for Jamstack, that was pre-building and
Mhm.
decoupling. Do you think that should still remain true, or does it need to evolve to include some of these like newer technologies and approaches?
I mean, I think some of it was worth including. Like, I don't think. I mean, I think if say we kind of stuck entirely to pre-building, there are a lot of use cases that fits. I mean, like that was my argument back when I was talking about static sites was like, hey, it turns out that a lot of sites are just content,
Mm,
and you can pre-generate content in many of the use cases where you're currently serving it, via dynamically generated every request kind of thing. And so, you know, I still think that fits a lot of sites, but I also think even a lot of those sites will have an exception. And you don't want to be, it's like, oh, hey, well, we have this section that has a bunch of dynamic stuff. And so like scrap that entirely. I can't do Jamstack because of that one section of my site. So now everything's going to be like traditional server rendered.
yeah.
And so I think the only way for it to get beyond like a niche tool would be that we adopt some of these things. But I've always kind of emphasized that it's like when I talked about it, it was static first. It was like
Mm,
if I can do this as static, I do it as static. If I can't, then how much of it can I do as static and what parts need to be server rendered or whatever. I mean, that's why I even love the concept of islands, because I think islands help kind of resolve some of that. It
yeah.
can it can kind of go all the way to another extreme where you're basically just server rendering everything anyway. But the idea that I could just say, hey, this part needs to be dynamic and maybe pull from a server, whereas like these other parts can be static. And even, I mean, if you look at Next.js, they're now kind of with their partial page rendering saying, "Oh, hey, it's not a terrible idea either," um, but with a kind of the different flavor. But point is, I think we all know like there are natural benefits to like static stuff. Um, which is the things that we pitched when we talked about Jamstack way back in the beginning, which was like it's inherently secure because there's nothing to hack into. It's inherently fast because it's just static. So like there are kind of built-in benefits to that I think we all like, even the people who tend to be kind of more advocating the SSR approach can agree like okay, you do get those things, and if there's not a particular drawback to statically generating some set of pages or portions of the site, then I'm all for it. I think it's the better approach.
Mm. There was a a video posted very recently titled
Yep.
"Static Site" or "Static Site Generators Are Dead." Is that the title, or
I
are
think it was
not?
that, yeah.
Something along those lines. And the main point was, in order to get performance, like a 20 millisecond page load, you had to generate a static site and put it on something like GitHub Pages. And
Mm.
now with fancy CDNs and global caching, you can have that on a dynamic site as long as it's very well cached. Do, do you think?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that line of thinking?
So, I mean, I think we have come a long way to where like we do get better performance now on server rendered stuff than before. It was like incredibly complicated, but now there's lots of services and tools that'll help you do this. I'd say it's not static sites do this by default. Like I just push up a static site and all those things are built in. I don't have to figure out how to like configure like global cat, like making my data available at the edge, or caching all the caching scenarios and things like that. Like all this that doesn't it doesn't play into a static site because hey, it's just kind of by default is there. And then the other thing is that, and I'll admit I only got like a part way through that video. Um, is I don't know that he talks about, but static sites are cheap, right? Like that's another big benefit that I don't think can be overlooked. Like all of those pieces that he brings up have a cost, right? Like I can't easily like I might have to pay for different services to handle all these things, like or and all of those pieces add up. So his approach seemed to be like lots of little pieces, like serverless pieces and caching pieces and et cetera. And it's like, okay, but they're not free. They're not free. And you get, even static sites can at some point you make incur some costs, but even when you start to, it's like so much smaller than what I might pay for, say, in AWS fees for hosting all this stuff server rendered.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's a cost in terms of complexity as well.
Yeah,
Because
there is. That's true too.
like with a static site, if I know HTML and CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript, it's a very small jump to learn a static site generator if I even get to a point where I need that. Whereas piling all these services together, back end and front end, and different platforms, that there is a technical bar there that is much higher.
Yep. That I would agree with that completely.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's an interesting one, eh? And I've heard that sentiment before, where like, okay, let's just put a cache in front of dynamic and then it's static. And I think of it in terms of like, well, you have to do the build somewhere. Well, if you have a purely static site and you're just no build, hashtag no build, then sure, no build. But then at a scale beyond like probably 1 or 2 pages, you almost certainly want to do some sort of build. And the question is, do you want to pre-build it, or do you want to build it on the fly as a user requests it and then cache? And I don't think it's as simple. I don't see those as equivalent. I see trade-offs for each one, and the trade-offs might be worth it, but there are certainly trade-offs.
Yeah, there's definitely trade-offs. And I mean, what's the old saying about caching being one of the hardest things in computer science? It's like,
Yeah,
this is why, honestly, I prefer, at least for me as a developer, if we have a huge team that like maybe we have some folks who know all this infrastructure stuff and are experts in that and can deal with it, I'm cool with that. But I don't really want to be messing with that personally if I'm, because I don't know. I feel like I can't get a static site wrong very easily. In fact, that's one of the things I loved about him is like, hey, I can't really break this.
yeah,
I can break the build, but then ultimately like it doesn't impact anything because hey, I broke the build, but it's just not
exactly.
going anywhere.
Whereas the dynamic solution, you break the build, but now it's happening on your production server and you didn't know about it.
Exactly. So, that's I just feel like there's so many, like you said, so much complexity that it's easy for me to kind of make a mistake that ultimately can impact the site. Whereas like static sites don't have that complexity. Now, I'm not saying like I think there is a place for that.
Yeah,
And
totally.
that's when I wrote like an original, like when I was originally talking about this stuff, and then I wrote like a report for O'Reilly, and then Ray and I wrote a book for O'Reilly. The case originally was like, hey, this isn't for everything. This
Yeah,
is just it's not a solution to solve every single website. Um, which is I think it's fair, and I didn't have a problem with that. I think what happens is, look, if I'm a platform trying to be you know, multi-billion-dollar company serving all, that doesn't really work. Saying like, yeah, we can't fit your use cases, and so ultimately, like, I think where Jamstack got too tied in with different services, and then we had okay, Netlify really owned the term, and then Vercel decided they were going to tag along, and then decided they were going to actually be anti Jamstack, even though both services were ultimately doing the same thing. And it, the term got a lot of baggage, to be
yeah,
honest, um, and that was a problem, and it was it made me ultimately be like, okay, well, the thing about Jamstack was that towards the end there, it's like a community, right? Like towards before Netlify kind of moved away from the term. There was a community behind it. There was a bunch of things like I could talk about, headless CMS, like, or like, serverless stuff and some of these frameworks and all of those, like whether we might differ on which exact tools we use, there was lots of overlap, right?
mm,
And so people could come together more broadly and talk about these things. And then I think, the problem with losing the term is that people kind of filter off into tool specific communities. Like,
yes,
oh, hey, I'm only going to hang out in the Astro Discord or the Next.js Discord or whatever, like and suddenly we're not talking to each other about cross-cutting kind of things that impact everybody. We're just kind of off in this very narrow world of just my framework.
yeah. And it becomes very dogmatic. Like my
Yeah.
this is the tool for everything, rather than hey, we're all aligned on this approach to things, and there's lots of different ways to doing it, and
Mhm.
here's one way I think's cool. There's another person here's another way I think's cool, and it's that knowledge sharing and kind of collective upskilling everyone that I think was really cool in the Jamstack community is missing now.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's why it's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day, and got on the topic of Jamstack stuff, the guy was like, "Hey, do you remember that article? Somebody wrote this article about Jamstack is done or something." And they're like, "Wait a second, was that you?" I'm like, "Yeah, that was me. That was me." I didn't expect that one to. I mean, I guess in retrospect, it makes sense because whenever you say something's dead, I mean, the funny thing is, like, it got picked up so many places, people citing it as Jamstack is dead, and the article was like, I think a lot more nuanced than that because
Yeah, people just read the headlines.
Yeah, and I don't even think I've officially called it dead. It was more like okay, the term may be dying, but or over, but the tools, I mean, we're all doing the same stuff. It's nothing changed from day to day because suddenly we're not going to use that term.
Yeah.
We're all still doing the same thing. So like it's still there, and it's none of them are, it's not like they're shrinking. They're still growing. All of these tools are growing incredibly. Like the adoption is, if you look at the numbers, at least the best numbers we have, the adoption is still going up on all of it, right? And yet all we did was just kind of lose this umbrella term, which I think had value. But it was, so it wasn't dead, but
yeah, I mean, it's the same like narrative that Netlify had. I mean, they didn't call it dead. They said that it's become so commonplace that we don't need the term anymore. Like we've moved on that. I don't quite agree with that, but
I don't agree with it either.
Yeah. Like, so let's talk about the definition. So my understanding of Jamstack is it started off very static world. The acronym was JavaScript APIs and markup. Yeah. And I think the idea is, okay, you have a purely static site. Anything that you want to bring in that's dynamic, you can essentially do through Ajax and bring in various APIs and have a lot of power there. And then over time, there were limitations that were found with that approach. And these platforms added different ways of dealing with that, essentially through serverless functions. So then that kind of became encompassed in the term. And then there was another step that happened where these frameworks started just going full server-side rendering, which is coming full circle. I'm not sure if the definition ever stretched that far. It's like very unclear. Before you mentioned pulling it back, where would you pull it back to?
So I think the definition did at some point start to encompass all those pieces, like the full server-side rendering, because it even dropped things like, I remember having a debate because it dropped things like security, because we can't claim it's more secure anymore if everything's on this, if ultimately we allow everything to be on the server, right?
Interesting.
And it just focused only on the decoupling aspect, which is, I mean, to be fair, Netlify really hasn't changed that aspect of it, right? Like they're still focused on decoupling. They just kind of transitioned to like a different angle on that and a different terminology, but and that's a little less purely developer focused and encompasses like, say, marketers and other things, right? Like that they can maybe has a bit more enterprise, that's easier to pitch to the enterprise, basically. But I'd say if I were to pull it back, I'd say when we started to kind of be like, okay, I'm going to take a step back here and say, at a certain point, the definition got so vague that people would make the argument that because I was using, JavaScript and I was using APIs and there was markup, like and it didn't matter what I built this with. Like essentially my PHP site was Jamstack.
Yeah.
And it was hard based on the way we defined it to argue that, right? Like,
it's like everything is Jamstack.
Yeah. And so I know we dropped the acronym and stuff, but we'd also like kind of made it so vague and amorphous that it was like, yeah, I mean, I guess based on the literal definition, yeah, all these things are Jamstack, which allow you to say like, hey, it became so common that everybody's already using it.
It's true.
Which I don't agree with that. I think because you and I seem to kind of be similar in the way we define it back a little bit and pushing with that kind of static first approach, where it's fine if you want to sprinkle in, some serverless functions and maybe even have like, you know, um, it doesn't like maybe even the whole section of your site has to be server rendered, but you have this whole portion that's like built statically with some dynamic pieces mixed in. I mean, it's not an all or nothing approach. I think that's the thing that I think people lost. It was like, well, if we're bonded to Jamstack, we got to do the whole site this way. It's like, I've worked on projects where it's like, hey, Jamstack doesn't make sense for the dashboard, right? That like when you log into the service and we're doing it, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense because all of this stuff, like literally the whole thing is all dynamic stuff and it's very user specific. But then when I'm on the front end of the site or I'm in the documentation or I'm in like, there's whole sections of a site that like typically built that don't require all that stuff. And I think the real world Jamstack ends up being like companies like that who do the front end, and maybe other portions of their site with a Jamstack approach, but still say, hey, you know what, this section, the admin or the dashboard, whatever it is, like, doesn't make sense as a Jamstack.
Yeah.
And so, or I think before the approach was like, okay, no, we need to define Jamstack so it covers that whole 100% of that site. And instead, I would pull it back and say, no, you know what? We used Jamstack approach for this portion, and that part, yeah, it's mostly server rendered. It's really not Jamstack. It's,
I completely agree because the difference in those two is if Jamstack is the complete umbrella, it makes it hard to have that conversation about, okay, we're going to switch this bit to dynamic because we need X, but we're willing to trade off Y. Or we're going to have this bit static because we don't want to have the trade-offs of that and we don't need to make those trade-offs. But if we have language, and we do have static versus dynamic as language, but I think there's not really a movement around static because of why Jamstack was coined in the first place. It's seen as like inferior and too simple to solve any problems. And that's really why the Jamstack was coined in the first place, is to give new light to that and give a nod to a lot of the browser evolution and ecosystem evolution that allowed static websites to become much more powerful. Whereas paring it back and having a tight definition, then you can say, okay, we're going to use this approach for this section of the site. We're going to use this approach for this site. And this makes sense because Jamstack is good at this and dynamic is good at this. And that's fine. And that's a good conversation to have. But with that umbrella term, it makes it more difficult to have that. And then everything's like, oh, okay, we need dynamic for this. So I guess we're in that world now.
So we're going to do everything, including, we have hundreds of content pages that are, almost completely don't change, that frequently. And yet we're going to, because we did this portion of the site dynamic, that's all going to be server rendered as well.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to me, but it can be tough to like have nuanced discussions about these things. I think there's the difference between what happens in companies who are just going to do. The developers are going to do what they need to do to get the job done in the first place, So they may take that approach, but then the discussion on a within like well, used what used to be Twitter and or wherever, like wherever that discussion is happening, tends to be a lot less nuanced than what happens
Exactly.
inside the company, people getting the job done, you know?
It's perfectly understandable, right? Like if you're in that, we think about Jamstack all the time and we talk about it all the time and we understand all the nuances. But if you're
Yeah.
just like, okay, I need to build this website, I've heard of Jamstack, let's do it. Like you won't have those nuances, and that's why the definition and the the understanding of the trade-offs needs to be so clear, so they can understand the nuances, because otherwise they're not going to get so deep in the Jamstack that they understand them, and it's just not
Yeah.
clear, I feel like, in the community at the moment.
No, yeah. And that was kind of, I think, by the lack of clarity was by design because we didn't want people coming like weaving, companies that a lot of the companies that were kind of, well, let's say Netlify, and I love Netlify. I'm not criticizing them. I understand your company, you need to do what you got to do. To like ultimately they want to be whatever, go public or whatever. I mean, they got to make a good deal of money, and narrowing your audience doesn't make sense,
Yeah,
saying like,
totally.
hey, you know what, we're not gonna solve your problems. So like, because we have this Jamstack term that we're like so dedicated to that, you know, we can't, you know, we're going to say, hey, these developers who want to do this dynamic stuff really don't fit with us.
Hmm.
So I get that. I think that makes sense. But at the same time, it just from those of us who were trying to kind of preach that approach, it made it difficult because it was just like, we had, I mean, there was a year worth of endless discussions of like, what the heck is Jamstack
Yeah.
anyway? Jamstack's identity crisis. Jamstack. It was like I felt like everybody was inviting me to different talks about like, you know, how nobody understands what the
Yeah.
Jamstack is
This is
anymore.
another one.
Yeah. So, but I mean, and then it just kind of, I think, settled down a little bit, but for a little while because it just kind of faded. And I'm still, I'll be honest, I've been, I use the term a little less than I used
Yeah.
to. Actually, quite a bit less than I used to. Even the newsletter, like, um, probably be undergoing a transition to like a new name.
Mm.
And it's hard because like I still believe in the principles, but like, and ultimately the content, the point, the idea that the Jamstack is dead, kind of doesn't. It's not that newsletter is just like I often am paring back the amount of content of what fits reasonably within the concept of Jamstack, and yet all I'm going to do is give it a new name. The content's the same, which just means like it's not dead. It's just which is kind of the term was kind of owned by a corporation, and once that corporation kind of decided they weren't going to maintain it, it became harder for the rest of us to do it, and you know, um, and we were already facing Jamstack identity crisis, kind of talk all the time. So it just became hard to kind of continue to use it because kind of seemed to be falling out of favor, even though the tools that it and the approach that it represented
Yeah.
hadn't fallen out of favor.
So what's your thoughts around the new name? What's the new identity?
I don't really have a good new name. That's the struggle. Like I've started just kind of calling stuff like full stack, but I'll be honest, I hate that term too. I
Mm.
hate the term full stack because I feel like it just doesn't as much as Jamstack was people had issues with the what Jamstack meant. Full stack. One of my issues has always been like it implies that a full stack developer knows more than they could possibly know. Like
Mm.
most people don't know everything front end, back end, database, serverless, like
Hmm.
and but so I'm years and years ago I made I wrote a post basically arguing that it was a term being pushed by companies who wanted to hire fewer people. And so like I don't need a front end developer and a back end developer. I'm just going to get a full stack developer, and that's one job for two
Mm.
things, you know?
Which
So
interestingly, it seems like that's where Next.js is heading, is let's merge those worlds together as much as possible.
yeah, I do think the tools have like started to evolve to a point where you are doing both, but I don't know. I'm curious how many real world projects like at significant companies really don't have like say a back end developer because they have just full stack people. Like I don't know that like even with Next.js, like ultimately like I got to be calling APIs and other pieces that are probably maintained by different teams if I'm at a real company. Like it's like you end up doing a lot of front end developers dipping into the back end, but basically to build a front end for the back end, like the what was it, the front end for back end, whatever, like I don't know if you've ever BFF kind of is
Haven't heard
the
that.
you haven't heard of that? Like
No.
it's actually an approach. It's called BFF, back end for front end, basically.
Okay.
In a lot of I think a back end of Next.js, I'm gonna hazard a guess that in many cases it's back end for front end. It's basically like I'm putting a back end that fits my website that actually speaks to a back end sitting somewhere else, maybe even within my own infrastructure, but that I need to kind of change that, kind of tweak it so that it works for the
Mm.
site.
It's kind of like
Um,
middleware, like
yeah,
translating
in a way.
a back end to a front end, that little bit in between.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and I don't have a problem with the approach. I actually think it's good, in a sense that when I used to do this years ago, we would wait on the back end team. They're like, well, we need the site done, and we're like, but we're waiting on the API to get updated because that team is much, takes a lot longer to push these changes out. And so like, whereas now I can just, oh, okay, I'll throw a serverless function in there, do some translations, and
Mm.
we're good. So I think it's fine, but I'm curious how many people are like literally doing full stack applications where the entirety of it, all the backend logic is really in Next.js
Mm.
as opposed to in something else at larger companies.
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah. I want to go back to the principles question, which
Sure.
is related to this. So initially it was pre-rendering and decoupling. And before you said something interesting where you were like that at least Netlify's definition of decoupling changed, or their angle on it. And I think it started off very clear. It was like, we're going to decouple the front end from the back end. And all the business logic is in the back end. And that's very easy to get your head around, I think. But I don't think it doesn't fit the definition of a serverless function. Well, it does if it's an API and you're consuming that on the client side. But if the serverless function is rendering a page, now it's not decoupled. It's you've got the front end and back end coupled together. So like, how does that term still work, and what's the angle that it's used at now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. It is decoupled. I think they would argue that that serverless function does not necessarily like performing all the back. It can perform be the entire back end, but in this case, I might still, be calling out to like a headless CMS for my content or some externals, that it's kind of still pulling all those pieces apart. So that back end serverless function really is just kind of like a intermediary
Got it.
to other decoupled
It's just like
services.
decoupling the services and like the
Yeah,
concerns. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think once we got into doing tools that rendered, that handled all the rendering on server side. And, from an application logic standpoint, it's not decoupled, but the services that make up that application are still decoupled. And I guess it depends on which pieces you think
Yeah.
are more important.
It's like a slippery slope, right? Because now I'm going to create a PHP file that pulls in content from a headless CMS and connects to Shopify. Does that fit the definition? Like, at what point is it not?
Yeah.
At what point, what is coupled?
Yeah. And I'd say they probably, like, if you were go to Netlify, I'd say they'd probably be like, yeah, that's composable. That's the new term, right? Like, which is where it didn't make sense. If you want to be a platform that can support that, it didn't make sense to be Jamstack because of the baggage Jamstack came with as far as, like, tooling and whatever. It's like, well, that's still composable, but it's not
Yeah.
Jamstack.
But it makes me think of WordPress. Like, WordPress is composable. I can have a form solution with X plugin, or I can have Y. I can swap it out. I can have e-commerce with X, Y, and Z. It's like very composable.
Yeah.
I
All
don't
you
think
need is
Netlify would
another
say
plugin.
that. Yeah.
No, just one more plugin. That's what we're.
Yeah.
um, yeah. I mean, I guess you could make that argument, which is where I'd say, look, at some point, all these terms are fuzzy, right? Like, I mean, one of my arguments against, like, some of the, for instance, people being like, oh, don't even want to use Jamstack anymore because it got too ambiguous. And I'm like, okay, but we use serverless, and serverless is ambiguous. Like, I mean, most of
Yeah.
these terms end up, like, we use terms like DevOps, and I mean, DevOps was a little more specific when it started. And as it got more mature, now it's like, what is DevOps? It's like 1,000 different things. I don't know what DevOps is. I mean, it's natural as we do these kind of terms, not just because a company decides, just because the tools evolve and start to be able to, we focus on, like, okay, if you think about even Next.js when it started, right? Like, I mean, and it was all server side rendering, and then they're going to do static and server side, but, like, it was one or the other. And then the tools just kind of evolved to be able to do more complex things. You can argue that maybe they've evolved to be overly complex. I would argue that they've evolved to be so complex as to be just confusing. But at the same time, like, that's going to happen all across all the tooling, and it's going to evolve to, like, do more things, and eventually the term becomes less clear than it was when we first came up with it. And that's fine. I'm comfortable with evolving a definition, and even with saying, hey, maybe this, you can say, like the term Ajax, which Netlify used to kind of make a lot of comparisons to with Jamstack, is like, okay, Ajax kind of went out of favor because, we just started doing it all the time, and, like, it didn't make any sense. I don't talk about responsive web design. I used to.
Yeah.
I used to go give talks about it because it's like, well,
assumed.
it's not different. It's just web design, right? Like,
Yeah, it's true.
that makes sense. I don't think the numbers back up that Jamstack is, that it disappeared because it was the approach of everybody. Like, I think if you look at some of the numbers of developers, like, it feels huge, but, like, the people using even tools like Next.js or Astro or Nuxt or whatever, from the overall community building even just web applications, is still a fairly small portion.
Yeah.
So,
Like,
I don't know that it's universally adopted to the point where it's, like, meaningless.
Yeah. Like, I think if you think of the majority of websites, they're probably they are a good fit for a static website. Like, it's documentation, it's simple marketing sites. It's like an event page. Like that is the majority of websites on the internet. But then in terms of dollars, it's like the more like application-y ones and huge scale. And that might be like 2% of websites. I don't know the number, but it's certainly the minority. But it's where by far the majority of the spend is.
Yeah, I could agree with that.
And that's like where why a lot of the conversations happen in that areas, because it's where the money's at. Yeah, but I still think there's such a good place for like the initial approach of Jamstack. Like I think of it as a cycle. In the 90s, we're just starting to figure out server-side rendering, and it's very simple. Like, oh, I don't need to if I want to change the header, I can just do that in one place instead of having to do it on 50 pages of my site. Amazing. And then we get WordPress, and it's like, oh, now I can have someone non-technical updating this and like use all these plugin ecosystem, and that's really powerful. But the complexity goes up and up and up in each step. And then that's why we have Jamstack. It's like, that stuff's really complex. Here's a very simple approach. You're just going to go static. There are tools now that you can edit the content. You can pull and do all this amazing stuff. And that was a breath of fresh air for a lot of developers. But then it's like, oh, but now we need to solve this use case, this use case, this use case. And I feel like we're getting back to that point where it's so complex that I think there is going to be that pendulum switch where it's like, oh, what about simplicity? Like, I don't want to deal with all these services and all this stuff. Yeah, and I think that's where Jamstack, or whatever Jamstack becomes, can really shine and be that voice.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, I came to it because I loved the simplicity. It reminded me of like my early days in web development, where it was like, especially early. I mean, it was just I knew one tool. Like I knew back when I got started, I knew Cold Fusion, and I could solve pretty much any problem with Cold Fusion. And honestly, I only had to design for one monitor size, because everybody like had the same size monitors. We all just that was fun. It's like, even for a while, I'm building stuff for one monitor size and one browser, because Internet Explorer had killed the alternative. So like, life was easy for a time. But yeah, we've gotten, I think, look, I've written about even all the different rendering options, and since then I think there's new rendering options. So like, let's make sense of it. And I think once you get to that point where you're like, okay, you need to learn this tool, but first you have to understand the 10 different ways you can render content. It's like,
yeah,
okay, I think you've already started to lose people, in my opinion. That's why, like, I tend to kind of pull back and stick with tools that simpler. Like for CFE.dev, I probably, if I started it today, I might choose like Astro, or I like SvelteKit, but I think I tend to like the developer experience of Astro a little better. But like, if I were to go, I still use Hugo for it, and it still works great. And there's not any reason, like, there's not any necessary, like, compelling reason to switch. The site does what it's supposed to do, and now it's like thousands upon thousands of pages after like 6.5 years of running it, and all of it works great. And I can, I've been able to like expand the site to cover different things. Even for a while, I did have a login, and all that worked. Where you could have pages that were protected by a login, etc. And that was all static, built with Hugo and just a dash of plain old JavaScript. And hey, you know what? And does it feel like a not dynamic site? I mean, I don't think so. Like, it's just, there's so much going on the site, and that I don't feel like it feels that way. But but it is just Hugo, and could probably run it on Hugo that I started it on 7 years ago, and it would work
Exactly.
just fine.
Yeah. And you could leave that for 20 years, and as long as you pay your domain bill and your infrastructure
Yeah,
bill, it'll be fine.
exactly. So, there's something to be said. You can build actually pretty cool things with some of these simpler tools, and there's a benefit to that for sure.
Yeah. Nice. Let's end on that note. I think that's a great sentiment. Brian, this is an awesome chat. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on
Me
today.
too. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, this was good. It's really good to kind of chat about these things. People, like I said, for a while we were all talking about it, and then I feel like the conversation ended. I do still think these are conversations worth having.
Yeah, agreed.